abroad and before Biden meets with Vladimir Putin. Welcome to The Lead. I'm Pamela Brown in for Jake Tapper. President Biden called today's NATO meeting incredibly productive and assured America's allies that the U.S. has NATO's back. Biden also said he is not looking for conflict with Russia, but will stand up for democratic values, calling Russian President Vladimir Putin a, quote, worthy adversary. Let's get right to CNN's Caitlin Collins live in Brussels. Caitlin, Biden said he would make clear where the red lines are for Putin.
Yeah, he did. But he also said, Pam, that he wasn't going to negotiate with the press and talk about what he expects the outcome of that summit with the Russian president to look like. He was essentially saying he is going into it and that he has communicated to NATO allies while here in Brussels what he intends to say to President Putin, I should note, while they are in Geneva on Wednesday meeting. And Pam, one interesting thing that the president did say is he said he has not gotten any pushback from NATO allies on this meeting. We had heard that there was some skepticism about whether or not now was the right time for the two of them to meet. Of course, we know that is skepticism that even existed inside the halls of the West Wing over advisors questioning whether now was the time to go into this summit. But President Biden justified the reason going into this and talking about what it's going to look like when they meet.
All right. Caitlin Collins, thanks so much. Stick around for a
Make clear
I didn't know.
to President Putin that there are areas where we can cooperate if he chooses. And if he chooses not to cooperate and acts in a way that he has in the past relative to cybersecurity and some other activities, then we will respond. We will respond in kind.
Now, of course, Pam, those comments about what Biden would do if President Biden does not listen to his warnings about cybersecurity, election interference, ransomware attacks that we've seen that the White House has said is being done by these criminal gangs that are based in Russia comes after Putin did that interview with NBC News where when he was asked about that and conducting this cyber warfare against the United States, he denied it and said there has been no evidence not only of the ransomware attacks but also of election interference. We know that's not true, but that is what Putin is saying ahead of the summit, already preparing his denials essentially. So when Jeff Zeleny, our colleague, asked President Biden what his policy is going to be with President Putin, essentially asking about Reagan's trust but verify. He said his policy with Putin is going to be verify, then trust his claims. Of course, his claims in the past to previous U.S. presidents, as President Biden knows well, have not always been followed through on. And one other thing we should know about that political prisoner, Alexei Navalny, who, of course, is sitting in jail in Russia right now, when he was asked in the NBC News interview about whether or not he would make sure that he did not die in prison, Putin said he could not commit to that and essentially would not even say his name, saying he didn't care what his name was. Well, President Biden said there that if he did die in prison, that it would be a sign that Vladimir Putin does not care at all about human rights. And he said his death would be a tragedy. So essentially laying down a marker ahead of that meeting, even though we know that the White House has said that will be a topic. Russia has said they do not plan for it to be one.
It was interesting because he was choosing his words so carefully, what he said about Putin before this meeting. But on that, he didn't hold back. Thanks so much, Caitlin. Stick around. We're going to have a larger discussion here. We've got Nia Malika Henderson, Gloria Borger, and others here joining us. So, Nia, let's talk about what we heard from Biden. He says he wants to look for areas where he and Putin can cooperate together. But he said he would also, quote, make it clear what the red lines are. Past presidents have tried this. How will Biden's approach be different? How will he be more effective from past presidents?
Well, I mean, if you think about the immediate past president, he certainly isn't in Putin's pocket in the way Trump was. He's certainly going to be tougher. He's going to believe what America says about Russia and not what Putin says about Russia's activities, particularly when you think about the cyber war and cyber terrorism that's going on. But this was such, I mean, I was in the makeup room listening to this. It was so different, right? The way he talks about NATO, cooperation with NATO, the importance of democracy, the importance of funding this alliance, right? So different from what we heard from Donald Trump, who was so down on this Western alliance, so down on NATO, really wanted them to pay up. And you have Biden here saying that the U.S. has a sacred commitment to NATO.
Yeah, he kept saying America is back. And it was interesting that he said, Gloria, that there was a consensus among the allies that he spoke with today about this meeting with Vladimir Putin and the timing of it, which is notable because because Biden wants to go into this meeting with Putin with the backing of his allies. He wants to go in a strong position. And I think that that's telling that he could do that.
And he also has said that he talked to them about what he was going to say to Putin. So he essentially consulted them. I couldn't agree with Nia more. This is a new president trying to turn the battleship around and say, you know, we are headed in a very different direction with Putin. And they have a relationship in the past, and it's not pleasant, and it's not pretty. And Biden said, I don't want to tell you what I'm going to tell him, except he told us what he's going to tell him. And he said, where we can cooperate, we will. But if you don't cut this stuff out, we're going to respond. Now, you remember in Helsinki, President Trump stood up there and said, well, I believe Vladimir Putin had nothing to do with election meddling. That's clearly not where Joe Biden sits right now. And in terms of Navalny, he couldn't have been clearer. He says that Russia has little or no intention of abiding by basic or fundamental human rights if Navalny dies, period. I mean, that is a striking comment from a president of the United States. And then what does the United States do in our relationship? So I think there's a lot on the table here, and Biden knows it, and I think he wants it.
Right. Before that, our colleague Jeff Zeleny had asked him, do you still stand by your comments that he is a killer?
Yeah.
And as you noticed, he did not want to directly go there and answer that. It's clear he was choosing his words carefully. But in Navalny, he was saying a message loud and clear. Josh Rogin, I want to bring you in, global opinion columnist for the Washington Post. Josh, Biden has met with Putin before. What is your view? Is he at an advantage?
Yes, I do think that Biden has set the table here by meeting with almost every NATO and allied leader that he could before sitting down with Putin. And that was designed to put the wind at his back so that he could represent not just himself, but the transatlantic alliance in a sense, despite the fact that, of course, there are a lot of differences inside that alliance, to be sure. But, you know, we had a long history in the United States of having a relationship with Russia that's both contentious and cooperative at the same time. I remember a president who was laser focused on human rights in the Soviet Union, but also negotiated with the Soviets. His name was Ronald Reagan, and he was able to do both at once. And, you know, that's called walking and chewing gum. It's called carrots and sticks. It's the stuff of diplomacy that we were really missing in our politics for the last 4 years, because the Trump administration was so chaotic and nobody knew what was going on, and the president was saying different things than his national security officials. And Putin had an advantage because of that. Our chaos was Putin's advantage, so maybe our competence can be our advantage.
We'll see. Caitlin, I want to bring you back in. Here's how Biden described Putin.
No expectations.
I have met with him. He's bright. He's tough. And I have found that he is as they say, when you used to play ball, a worthy adversary.
A worthy adversary. Caitlin, what do you make of that?
I think that this is President Biden's way of setting himself up for this meeting and how they're going into it. Of course, they're just days away. And I do think it's notable that when he was asked if he maintained his stance that Putin is a killer, he turned back to note that he was asked that in an interview and was responding to a question, an interview that he did with ABC News. But he said he doesn't think that calculus, that he does believe Putin is a killer, plays a factor into them going into this meeting, which is very interesting given, of course, that is certainly a condition for not meeting with other world leaders, considering their past acts. But he was saying there that essentially that he doesn't feel like the playing field is not level between the two of them when they're going into this and what that's actually going to look like. And I do think that those are maneuvers you've seen Putin try to use when he's met with several other former U.S. presidents in the past, as he has tried to really outsmart them or embarrass them at times in public settings. That is part of the calculus going into them not having a joint press conference after. The Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, when he was asked by Dana Bash why they weren't having one, cited something about the free press being able to ask questions. But when Biden himself was asked by reporters the other day, he said it's because he didn't want their meeting and their sit down to be judged by their interactions at that press conference, whether or not they shook hands or tried to embarrass one another. So I think he's just recognizing the kind of world leader that Putin is and that he's going to be sitting down with. But it will be fascinating given the White House has said they do not expect any deliverables to really come out of this meeting. So I think it's more of a leveling situation where they're going to see if this could be a meeting that they have again in the future, or if this could be the only meeting we ever see between President Biden and President Putin. There are a lot of unknowns walking into Geneva just a few days from now.
All right, Caitlin, thanks for that. So on that note, Nia, what metric would be considered a success? at the end of this meeting? I mean, as we just heard from Caitlin, the White House is trying to set a low bar for expectations.
Yeah, and I think that's smart going in. In some ways, it is the tone, right? It is the massive shift from what we saw from Donald Trump siding with Putin
Over the U.S.
intelligence folks in terms of what happened in the 2016 election. It's the posture of the United States and Biden embodying that posture and going in, and Caitlin mentioned this, going in with the wind at his back, right? All of these leaders cheering him on, essentially, right? I mean, that's what he said. He said everyone is happy. All of those leaders from NATO and the G7 are happy that he's having this meeting. So I think that's pretty much what it is, a return to normalcy coming out in a press conference in underscoring this idea that America is back, America is leading, America is part of the world, America wants to uphold and cheerlead democracies. As we know, we sort of have a problem with our own democracy here. And I think that really is what they're going to try to do tomorrow. And I think or Wednesday, and they are smart, I think, to lower the stakes and say, listen, there probably won't be any deliverables, any signing ceremonies or anything like that, or agreements with Putin.
I wonder, talking about democracy, Biden alluded to this, right? That democracy is being challenged in many ways in an unprecedented way. Does that put President Biden in a weaker position at all in this meeting?
Well, he was asked that question by the Washington Post. I think, here you are as a president, your own election's being challenged at home, and he ended up talking about the phony populism of, we know who he was referring to there, and the Republican Party and how it's being diminished. And there's a lot of controversy over whether that is in fact true or not true, because here he is trying to say, look, unless we defend democracy, Russia, China become an existential threat to us. When in fact, he's looking at what could be an existential threat at home. And, the question is, how do our allies respond to what's going on in the United States? And I don't think we really know the answer to that. What he was trying to do today is say, we're here, we're back, we're strong, we got it. But I think everybody is probably nodding and saying, well, let's just see how this gets handled back in the United States. But also, they're glad he's there.
But they've also, like you point out, I mean, there's been a little bit of whiplash for them, right?
Oh,
so
totally.
to say the least. So they're also treading carefully. But Josh, I'm going to bring you back in because President Biden said the U.S. will respond in kind if Russia continues to act aggressively. But we also know, and we just heard it recently from the energy secretary, that Russia is in the United States power grid. I mean, Russia also has a very aggressive cyber operation. So what exactly could the U.S. do to respond in kind if Russia continues to act aggressively that wouldn't continue to elevate into a state of war?
It's a great question. I think you've got two types of actions. You've got the covert actions, and then you've got the overt actions. And they always, the Biden people always like to say, well, we'll respond at a time and place of our choosing. That's indicating that there are going to be some covert actions to respond. But I think what the public and what Congress are calling for are for some overt actions, some sanctions on individuals who are directly responsible or directly supervising some of these units and some of these Russian entities that are attacking us, that are attacking our infrastructure and our companies. And I think that the farther you go up with those sanctions, the more biting they get. And I think that has to be the next step if this doesn't stop. And I think the only way to really communicate that is at that leader level. And that's why the Biden-Putin meeting can actually be valuable, I think, is because Biden can tell Putin what he really cares about. And what he really cares about is protecting American democracy, protecting American companies, but also things like Syria. You mentioned, where they can work together. The president of the United States said yesterday, he called it Libya. He was actually talking about Syria. But he was talking about humanitarian aid routes in Syria. So this is another thing that's going to be on the agenda that I've written about. So, when you talk about sort of how we can deal with a Russia that's going to continue to be autocratic, Putin's always going to be a killer. They're always going to wish us harm. But at the same time, we have to find a way to be frenemies because there are lots of things in the world where we're going to need to work with them one way or the other.
Absolutely. Caitlin, if you would remind us again what the circumstances are around this meeting. We know under President Trump, we both covered that, he would sometimes ditch the note takers during the meetings. If you would remind us what we expect to see and what happens next for President Biden before that meeting with Putin.
Yeah, or in some of those meetings between Trump and Putin, they would only have a note taker in the room, and then Trump took his notes, that person's notes afterward, or they'd only have translators in the room. We've asked the White House who they expect to be in the room when Biden and Putin do meet. They have not told us yet. I think that really speaks to just how last minute the negotiations between the U.S. side and the Russian side really are going to be. We do expect them to go essentially until the last minute in Geneva, and so we have been told that they do expect a smaller session and then one bigger session. The smaller session, it does appear, could potentially be a one-on-one between the two leaders. That really remains to be seen, but he did meet one-on-one with Erdogan earlier today, and according to President Biden, they were one-on-one for quite some time. We know he did want to talk to the Turkish leader about Putin, and so whether or not they were comparing notes, what that looks like, remains to be seen. But then they said there also is going to be a larger meeting that would likely be with their staffs while they are in Geneva, and so we'll likely see how that actually ends up the day of. I don't think we'll get a lot of concrete information on that beforehand. We should note that tomorrow he does have the EU summit as well, and the White House really says all of this is building to that sit down with Putin. They've used that as a justification, saying that he's meeting with these allies, and President Biden maintaining there that he has not heard from a single world leader, he says, that doesn't believe now is the time for the United States to meet with Russia. We'll see if that is still the understanding after that summit happens, and it remains to be seen.
And Jeff Zeleny, I want you to join us now. You were there. You were there questioning the president, asking him about his personal views of Putin. What was your takeaway with his response?
Well, Pamela, it's clear that President Biden still views Vladimir Putin as a killer. We asked that question because over the weekend in an interview with NBC News, Vladimir Putin laughed when asked his reaction to President Biden suggesting earlier this spring that Putin was a killer. So I asked President Biden that. He laughed back, laughed as well. And then he essentially went on to say that, indeed he does, but that does not really change anything. He knows exactly what he's walking into. But Pamela, I think the interesting part of this, President Biden stayed here at NATO really until he's one of the last leaders here, if not the last leader here, talking to a variety of world leaders, most of whom are in the region, who have some, direct dealing or a concern with Russia, the Baltic states, others. So this is something that he's been gathering information all day long here. But asking him, he has repeatedly said if Russia finds that it's in their own interest, he hopes that they will agree to cooperation in some respects. But I asked him, what if they do agree to cooperate? How will you ever trust Vladimir Putin? And he says you verify first and then trust. So, of course, a play, obviously, on Ronald Reagan's famous line with Mikhail Gorbachev, which actually their first summit also in Geneva. So some historical context there. But President Biden said, as far as he's concerned, he will verify first and then trust. But, Pamela, there's no question. What happens at the meeting on Wednesday is going to set the tone for the relationship between President Biden and Vladimir Putin. He's the fifth American president to meet with Putin. We'll see if Biden is any different.
We will see, and that is why those first few questions from reporters were focused on this subject, and we did glean a little bit about Biden's mindset going into it. Thanks so much, everyone, for the great discussion there. And as Biden prepares to meet Putin, there are new potential war crimes by Russia, mass killings and torture allegedly carried out by Russian mercenaries abroad. The story you'll see only on CNN. Plus, conspiracy theorists potentially going from digital soldiers to real-life violence. The terrifying warning from the FBI, up next. Breaking news in our politics lead right now. Attorney General Merrick Garland is meeting with executives from CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post on Trump's Justice Department secretly seizing records from reporters and Democratic lawmakers who were also on former President Trump's enemies list. There is still a lot we don't know, but I'm going to bring in CNN's Evan Perez to help us better understand this. But first off, Evan, what do we know about this meeting with media executives and the Attorney General today?
Well, Pamela, that meeting just got underway just a couple floors above where I'm sitting, and you can hear, you can believe that the media executives are going to be pressing the Attorney General for what permanent changes might be made as a result of the seizures of these reporter records. But he's also dealing with another fire that's already sort of burning, which has to do with the seizure of records belonging to lawmakers who knew about it. It appears that everybody that you and I and some of our colleagues have been calling, nobody says that they knew about the seizure of phone and email account information belonging to Adam Schiff, Eric Swalwell, as well as staff members and some of their family members. But what we now know is that the Attorney General has asked Lisa Monaco, the Deputy Attorney General, to essentially go looking for where the bodies are buried here in this building. I'll read you just a part of what the statement that was issued this morning from the Attorney General, the first time, by the way, that he has actually said anything about this. He said, political or other improper considerations must play no role in any investigative or prosecutorial decisions. These principles that have long been held as sacrosanct by the Justice Department career workforce will be vigorously guarded on my watch, and any failure to live up to them will be met with strict accountability. And then he goes on to say that he's asked for the Inspector General to look for this investigation, to investigate everything that happened here. And if during that process there are things that were done improperly, he says he will make fixes immediately.
I noticed, just looking at his statement, he didn't talk about the Don McGahn seizure as well, who, of course, he was the White House counsel back in 2018 when DOJ also seized his records. What more do we know about that?
Well, we don't know a hell of a lot. We know that a lot more, frankly, about the seizure of records belonging to lawmakers and to reporters. We don't even know what information Apple turned over to prosecutors who made that request. And similarly, Pamela, we have not been able to figure out what this investigation is about and who authorized it. Again, it appears from the statement from the Justice Department today, Merrick Garland saying that perhaps there needs to be a change of procedure if some high-profile person is being targeted, and the prosecutors and the agents who are working the case, they need to be able to tell the bosses up high so they can get at least the proper approvals.
Right. The mystery in many ways continues as we just try to continue to piece this together. Evan Perez, thank you for bringing us the latest there from the Justice Department. I want to turn now to our politics lead, an FBI warning to lawmakers that QAnon followers may start targeting them with actual violence. It's a story you'll see first on CNN. Let's bring in senior national correspondent Alex Marquardt. So what's behind this warning? Any new intelligence?
Well, this is a two-page unclassified FBI report that was obtained by our colleague Zach Cohen. And what it essentially says is that some adherents of QAnon, the conspiracy theory, are going to start taking matters into their own hands in a violent way, because a lot of what they believed would come true has not come to pass. Things like President Trump reassuming the presidency back in March. That obviously was never going to happen. Remember, Pamela, at its core, this is a conspiracy theory that is rooted in this belief that the deep state, these global elites, as they call them, are running a satanic child sex trafficking ring that is often referred to as a cabal by the followers of QAnon. So because a lot of the predictions that are just crazy have not come true, some, the FBI says, may now turn to violence. I want to read you part of this unclassified report that we obtained today. It says, some domestic violent extremist adherents of QAnon likely will begin to believe they can no longer trust the plan referenced in QAnon posts, and that they have an obligation to change from serving as digital soldiers towards engaging in real-world violence, including harming perceived members of the cabal, such as Democrats and other political opposition, instead of continually awaiting cues, promised actions which have not occurred. So the report does go on to say that because some are disillusioned that they may leave the movement, also because they're seeing less of this material online, because frankly, this stuff is getting kicked off the major social media sites. But there is what the FBI is essentially calling a fork in the road. Some will leave and hopefully go back to their normal lives, and others will simply become more extreme and possibly turn to violence.
And of course, you hear about this warning and you think, well, what about January 6th? Weren't there QAnon followers there engaging in violence? I mean, this warning is really consistent with what we've been hearing from national security officials for months now,
That's
right?
That's absolutely right. The FBI has said there were at least 20 people who took part in January 6th who are self-described adherents of QAnon. You can imagine, Pam, that there probably are a lot more. The Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, have consistently said that the most persistent lethal threat to this country are white extremists who are disillusioned, who believe that Donald Trump was robbed, who believe that January 6th was a good thing. And there's a lot of overlap between some of the violence that we've already seen and is being predicted and these adherents of QAnon.
All right. Thanks so much, Alex. Appreciate it. And coming up, Vladimir Putin couldn't even say Alexei Navalny's name earlier. Or he could, but he just didn't want to. Now President Biden just sent a warning if the Kremlin critic were to die in Russia's custody. In our politics lead, a group of House Republicans want to censure Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota and members of the so-called Squad after controversial comments Omar made last week, seemingly comparing the U.S. and Israel to the Taliban and Hamas, which the State Department considers a terrorist group. Omar later clarified, but Florida Republican Congressman Mike Waltz said in a statement, for members of the U.S. Congress to make equivalencies to Israel and the American military, which puts its own soldiers at risk to avoid civilian casualties, is ignorant of the facts, shameful, and should be condemned in the strongest terms. CNN's Ryan Nobles joins me now. So, Ryan, what would censuring these congresswomen mean, and is it likely to happen?
Well, I'll answer the second question first, Pam, and it's not likely to happen. But what we see Republicans doing here, and it's not just this attempt by Congressman Walz, but we're also told the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy may attempt to bring a privilege resolution to the floor that would strip Congresswoman Omar of her position on the Foreign Affairs Committee. There's another resolution that's floating around amongst Republicans attempting to censure the Congresswoman. What this is all about is attempting to make Democrats take a position on these comments that the Congresswoman has made and essentially try and find a divide between the progressive members of the House Democratic Caucus and the more moderate and middle of the road members of the Democratic Caucus. Democrats aren't interested in having that public of a fight. This certainly played out on Twitter last week, but we did see over the weekend both the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's rushed to Omar's defense. They were on CNN this weekend, both saying that both sides have already moved past this. They don't want this to become a big problem, but what we're seeing Republicans do is do everything they can to continue to sow that discord between the different factions of the Democratic conference. Pam.
So what more can you tell us about how the House Democrats are responding to this?
Well, first of all, they're essentially singing from the same playbook now. They're saying that they are thankful that Omar clarified her remarks and that they're ready to move on. And then just in the last few minutes, we saw that Representative Brad Schneider of Illinois, who is a Jewish Democrat and was among that group of Democrats that was most critical of Ilhan Omar's comments, he just put out a statement saying that he plans to bring a resolution to the floor this week to censure Marjorie Taylor Greene, the controversial Republican Congresswoman from Georgia, for the comments that she has made, comparing mask mandates to the Holocaust and talking about Hitler in those terms. This shows that Schneider's much more concerned about Greene's rhetoric than he was about what Omar had to say, and that he's hopeful that Omar has clarified those remarks and they're able to move on. Now, we're not exactly sure how many people are going to get involved with this resolution, whether or not that will even be passed on the House floor. This may be a fight that Nancy Pelosi isn't interested in having, but what we're seeing right now is an attempt by Democrats to quell this uprising right now within their ranks and talk about things that they would much rather talk about, which is infrastructure, a police reform bill, things along those lines. Pam, we'll have to see if they're successful.
We will have to see. Ryan Nobles, thanks so much. A new COVID variant warning that could impact everyone. That's next. To our health lead now, the reopening of America continues, with California set to lift most COVID restrictions tomorrow. But today, there are some serious reminders of where we've been and where we could go again if vaccination rates continue to plunge. With a former FDA chief warning that areas with low vaccination rates could be inviting the severe new variant that ravaged India, as CNN's Nick Watt reports.
Looks like today we will pass 600,000 people killed by this virus in this country. Yes, average new case counts are now a tiny fraction of the peak, but the so-called Delta variant could cause more pain.
Right now in the United States, it's about 10% of infections. It's doubling every 2 weeks.
Today in England,
I think it is sensible to wait just a little longer.
They delayed reopening due to a Delta-driven surge.
This could spike a new epidemic heading into the fall. The vaccines seem to be effective.
The real risk is all the unvaccinated people who are very, very vulnerable to this variant.
In part, why President Joe Biden wants 70% of American adults to have had at least one shot by July 4th.
I need you. I need every American to do their part.
Current projection will fall short, in large part because of a stark partisan divide. 14 states already reached 70%, and every single one went for Biden in the last election. Not a single state that went for Trump has even reached 65%.
It's exactly where I expect to see it start spreading. It makes me so sad that this virus has become politicized.
Another potential issue come the fall, schools.
We have to do better. We have to maintain a level of urgency.
In April, 90% of K through 8 schools were open. Doesn't mean 90% of kids. Take the 4th grade. Only about 50% attended fully in person, in large part because
families couldn't handle the hybrid option. They either need them in every day or home remote. So we need all students to have in-person learning every single day in the fall. Hybrid should not be an option as a primary option. It can be done.
Now, another issue for the fall, are there going to be things that only vaccinated people are allowed to do? Well, New York Presbyterian, that is a massive hospital system, just said all its staff must be vaccinated by September 1, and starting tomorrow in Disneyland.